Okay, so this is the study guide review for exam 2 for Soc 5. All right, so first up is chapter 15, Intro to Crim. So I'm looking for, a lot of these are just the definitions from your textbook, right? So binge drinking is heavy episodic drinking, which is, also defined as drinking so much alcohol in a 2-hour period that you have at least a 0.08 blood alcohol concentration. Right? Designer drugs, what I want you to know there is that most designer drugs are derivatives of approved drugs, and because of that, they circumvent existing legal restrictions. Let's see, difference between drug-defined crimes and drug-related crimes, right? Meaning that drug-defined crimes involve the sale or possession of an illegal substance, while drug-related crimes involve violent behaviors induced by the effects of a drug or illegal activity that is motivated by continued drug use. So again, just the definition from your book. Interdiction, same deal, definition from your book. Basically how they try to implement strategies to interrupt illicit drug trafficking, right? Stopping drugs from flowing over borders. That's interdiction. Eradication is just strategies that focus on basically destroying growing operations. So that's usually the removal of opium poppies, coca bushes, or the cannabis plant. When it comes to decriminalization, again, definition from your book. I'm not trying to be difficult here if you just read your actual book. So that is the policy related to labeling theory, which argues that there should be less harsh punishments for minor offenses such as possession of small amounts of marijuana. Harm reduction. Again, guess what? Definition from your book. This is basically a public health approach to lessen the risks and harms associated with illegal drug use. So that could be the examples we talked about, like needle exchange programs, right? Something like that, that reduces the harm of people contracting diseases that use injection drugs. All right, moving on, chapter 3, Code of the Street. Okay, so there I'm just talking about how when we talked about the submerged 10th that Du Bois is talking about, how, the submerged 10th are people that are, beneath the surface of economic viability, and they're often characterized as irresponsible, drunks, or violent thieves. Deindustrialization and globalization, all I'm looking for there is that these are two issues that had huge, profound effects on the economies of inner city neighborhoods, right? The loss of these jobs. And of course, globalization is linked to deindustrialization, right? Deindustrialization wouldn't be possible without globalization being able to open up markets in other countries in order to move those factories somewhere else. Okay, as far as this idea that, actually this one's pretty straightforward, just that violence as a means of social control is what happens within the code of conduct, what he calls the code of the street, that regulates the drug trade, right? Just that people use violence as a means of social control. And we talked about this a little bit in class, right? Like the idea that if you were a drug dealer and you don't implore violence as a means of that control, then you don't really have a guarantee that someone's going to pay you back, or someone's going to respect you enough, or someone isn't going to rip you off, or something of that nature. All right, go for bad. What I'm looking for there is just that, there are reasons that decent youth become street-oriented, and most of the time it has to do with the fact that they see drug dealers in the community having more status, having more access to women, having more money, having more power, and that often lures young men that were decent oriented into street mentality. The avoiding stick-up mentality, he goes into this quite a bit in that chapter. Just the idea that a lot of people in the community think you can avoid being robbed if you just don't go out at night, or if you don't go to areas that are considered gang territories, or areas that are like dark or unlit, or places where you're alone, right? Like an alley. And really, when people do get mugged, since there's this assumption that people can avoid a stick-up, there's kind of a blame that's put on the victim, like, well, why'd you go out at night then? If you didn't want to get robbed, why'd you go out at night? Which is like a terrible way to deal with that. Let's see. Okay, so chapter 4, the mating game, pretty straightforward here. What I'm looking for is how social class, basically how that is related to dating, right? We talked about this a lot in class, how, you know, the higher your social class, the more controlled your dating is, like who you have access to and who you date. Most people end up dating people of the same social class because that's who you come in contact with, right? We're pretty segregated. But it has more than gender, sexuality, religion, or any of those other things. It has a profound impact on who we end up dating, how we date, those kind of things. Two opposite drives. Basically, Anderson's trying to say that while women are looking for someone to love that's going to provide them financial support and get them out of the bad economic situation that they're in, a lot of young men, their goal is looking for, you know, sex, basically, to gain status with their friends by having sex with more women, right? So that this causes an inherent conflict because the goal of dating is very different. All right, common conception that young women have various sexual partners. This means that because that's kind of an assumption within a lot of these neighborhoods, that means that a lot of young men don't claim their children, right? It's assumed that these women are having a lot of sex and that if they say it's someone's kid, they're just trying to trap him, right? And objectification, what I'm talking about there is just how, you know, Anderson, he calls that chapter the mating game, right? Talking about it as if it's a game. So if it is a game, what's the object of the game? Basically, it's for, you know, from the perspective of men, the object of the game is to not just control a woman's body and have sex with her, but also convince her, like, make her fall in love with you. So it's not just a matter of, like, tricking her into having sex. It's a matter of tricking her into thinking that you're some knight in shining armor that's going to whisk her away. So it's about controlling her body and her mind, right? Alrighty, chapter 9. Okay, so what I'm looking for there, actually the kind of question it's going to be is which of the following is not an element of differential association theory. So remember, in the chapter, they go into it in depth. Actually, in the PowerPoint, there's a list of these as well. As long as you know what the different elements of differential association theory are, you'll be fine. Okay, classical conditioning, that's just straight up the definition from your book. It's a learning model that assumes that animals, as well as people, learn through associations between stimuli and responses. Right? The Pavlov's dog situation, ringing a bell, the dog drools, that kind of thing. Differential reinforcement theory, what I'm looking for there, same deal, definition. You guessed it. So that's a theory of criminal behavior that emphasizes various types of social learning, specifically classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and imitation or modeling theory. So it kind of combines all of those to understand how we, you know, come to understand what is right and wrong through our learning process. Operant conditioning is again, definition from your book, is a learning model based on the association between an action and the feedback that follows the action, meaning if something is negatively or positively reinforced, it's going to have a different impact on your learning. Let's see. Bandura's theory of imitation modeling, you guessed it, definition. So that's a learning model that argues that a significant amount of learning takes place absent of any form of conditioning. And instead, people learn a lot of their attitudes and behaviors simply from observing the behaviors of others. And remember in the book, they talk about this, the Bobo doll situation where kids would watch adults being violent towards a specific toy. And then, you know, some were the control group where they didn't see that video, some did see that video. And then in this experimental design, he'd have the kids go in, and the ones who watched the video where adults were violent towards the doll would be more violent towards the doll, meaning that oftentimes we just kind of monkey see, monkey do. Let's see. Techniques of neutralization are basically ways that people try to justify their criminal behavior, right? So in your book, it lists the 5 different techniques, so I'm just going to kind of test your knowledge of those, which is, you know, the first being denial of responsibility. So just saying, you know, it was an accident. Denial of injury, saying, well, it didn't hurt anybody. denial of the victim, right? Basically saying that maybe they caused an injury, but that person was the actual wrongdoer. Condemnation of the condemners, which basically you focus the attention from your deviant act to the motivation for that act. And then the appeal to higher loyalties, right? Where basically people try to say, well, it's because I was part of this gang, or because I was part of this group, or, snitches get stitches, or whatever. Anyway, those are the techniques of neutralization. All right, so chapter 5. Okay, so as far as the elements that reflect tradition, that's really all I'm testing you there on. We talked about how the code of the street is obviously a challenge to mainstream social order, but at the same time, it tends to have these traditional elements such as decency and violence that run through not just this culture, but through the larger culture over a long period of time. So the decent daddy, just what he is characterized as. So that's all I'm looking for there. So meaning he's an important role model. He has, certain expectations about how his wife is going to treat him, how his kids treat him, and typically he has something to offer, meaning a job or, those kind of benefits to other people in the community. And that he's not just a support or role model just for his biological kids, but also for the other kids in the neighborhood. Alrighty, so these ones we talked about, these systems. So caste system is just a system of stratification where what opportunities you have is based on how you were born, right? Like a group you were born into. Racial apartheid was a policy of segregation and political and economic discrimination against non-European groups in the Republic of South Africa up until the early 1990s. And remember, there's a video on the PowerPoint that kind of explains it in a few couple minutes just to kind of refresh your memory. Class mobility is the ability of a person to move up or down a social class within their own lifetime, which is extremely difficult to do. And we've talked about it before. The only, not the only, but the best way, I guess being a YouTube star could be that nowadays, but the best way to achieve class mobility within someone's lifetime is getting an education, right? Because the education is going to get you better job opportunities, and better job opportunities are, guess what, going to get you cash money. Conflict theory, just that when they're arguing that relationship to the code of the street, they're talking about how capitalism doesn't give everyone the same opportunities, right? Some people are born really rich, some people are born really poor, and some people have a lot more control over financial means than others. So that causes this inherent conflict between those who have and those who don't, what they call the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, right? Anyway, you don't need to know that because spelling bourgeoisie is very difficult. Social reproduction just means that a lot of people that are stuck in a social class tend to learn the values of their social class, and it tends to get reproduced over time, right? So, for example, a lot of people in lower working class families are taught a strong work ethic, right? Because they're taught that the only way that they're going to be able to financially survive is by working very hard and lots of hours, right? So that just means that you start to learn those things, and they tend to get passed on generationally. Everyday class consciousness is this idea that we have some awareness of our own social class and of the social class of others just based on, how someone looks, how they dress, what kind of car they drive, how they talk, how they walk, all of those kind of things. So yeah, that's everyday class consciousness. All right. Chapter 6. So just the role of mother, and by extension grandmother, has been very important as a role of strength and stability within the African American community, or within African American families for many generations, right? That's all I'm looking for there. Hegemony, remember I gave you that video definition of it, though I'm not sure why it didn't show it as much as you could only hear it in the video. I'm not really sure why that happened. Anyway, so the definition I'm looking for there is just the dominance of one social group over others, not just financially or in that kind of status place, but the people that are in power get to dictate the ideology and values that we all have, meaning rich people, we all inherently have the value system that we want to have a bunch of money and that we want to own a bunch of stuff and all of those kind of things, meaning that the hegemonic role or the hegemonic values of society reflect the values of the rich or the ones that have power. Let's see. Oh, the advent of the industrial economy and the role of grandmother. Just that the role of grandmother was very important, but then once the industrial economy took over, men of color were able to get higher wages within the factory system than women could. So the role of grandmother kind of subsided and didn't have quite as much importance as it did before the advent of the industrial economy. Grandmothers are kin keepers. What that means is that they end up connecting the family and holding them together across generations. They're typically the ones that have like holidays that are in contact with all, extended family. So they tend to be that's what's called a kin keeper, right? Also, decent grandmothers are often activators. Anderson just means that oftentimes, like in the case of teen pregnancy, in that chapter, that a grandmother would be able to get other family members to kind of step up and help out, or just even get them to provide resources or, some sort of help. Basically being able to kind of get the family to lend support through, just kind of pulling their leverage, right, in that way. Okay, religious ideology, just that a lot of these grandmothers the decent grandmothers, are very religious and are very connected to their religious communities. So a lot of them see crack addiction and the violence that comes of it and the problems that result of it within teen pregnancy and within, problems that their children might have if they're addicted to these drugs. They see it as a test by God, or they see it as like the devil trying to, influence their children or something of that nature. So it's understood in a kind of like religious context. All right. Let's see, chapter 10. Basically there, I'm just looking for the difference between primary deviance and secondary deviance. I'll give you a hint. It's the definition from your book, right? So primary deviance is the minor, infrequent offending that people do after they've been caught, right? While secondary deviance is the much more serious or frequent offending that people commit after they've been caught and labeled as offenders. Let's see. Basic assumptions of labeling theory. Those ones, there's a ton of them in your book. I suggest, and they're also in the slides as well. There's like 2 slides in that PowerPoint that go over that. I just suggest you kind of go over those so that you have a good understanding of what those assumptions are. So, there's a few of those, but basically this idea that, definitions of criminality tend to be reflective of who's in power, that something isn't necessarily considered criminal inherently, that it's who's doing it and who says that they're, whatever. Anyway, I suggest you go over all of those because that's kind of hard to wrap up here. Peacemaking criminology, hint, definition from your textbook. That's going to be the incorporation of religious, feminist, and critical theories that basically say that society should try to reconciliate offenders through mediation and dispute settlement, right? Trying to basically bring people back into the community, and give them the ability to kind of like reconcile their position from what they've done wrong. Retributive justice versus restorative justice. So again, definitions from your book. Retributive just means basically punishing someone, giving them a sentence for doing something wrong, versus restorative justice is, trying to basically get the victim together with the offender and the community and have the person kind of, atone for what they did wrong, but also make them linked back to the community itself. So, because a lot of research focuses on how people don't feel connected to the communities, especially after they're released from prison. And so this is kind of a way to get people to feel more connected again and back into society by giving them an opportunity to atone for what they did wrong, but also, kind of have some sort of mediation and fix those issues within the community. All right, short answer essays. Okay, so remember, what I'm looking for there always is answering each part of the question. So you can see the first one has 3 parts, So does the second one. All right, so first one. According to Elijah Anderson, the code of the street is an oppositional culture in the inner city streets of Philadelphia. I guess that's not part of the question. Why does he say it is the result of profound alienation? Right? So I'm basically giving you the answer there. It is the result of profound alienation. Why does he argue that? What does he mean by profound alienation? Right? Obviously, lack of economic opportunities, racial discrimination in a larger society, the social context of white supremacy, all of those kind of things, right? So I want you to kind of lay that out and explain what he's arguing about the profound alienation, right? And then what are residents alienated from? Hint, larger society, middle class white society. And how does the code seek to rectify alienation? Well, the code basically sets up a whole different societal value system that is oppositional to the larger society. It's not trying to basically like fit people into dominant society. It's trying to create its own society that says, screw dominant society, here's what my values say instead, right? And really it does that as a kind of a protective layer because people are really being not afforded the kind of respect and dignity in the larger culture that they deserve. All right, so number 2, what is the war on drugs? Explain. Explain what the war on drugs is, right? So it is basically a political approach that has, changed the relationship between policing and the focus on drugs as being an issue, a social issue within our culture, right? So I kind of want you to explain, a little bit of what you learned through the film and through the book, right? We've been talking about the war on drugs like ad nauseum, and we're going to continue to, so. Anyway, I want you to explain, not just the war on drugs is a thing that Nixon started, blah. Like, I really need some sort of substantial argument there. Okay, has it been successful? This is obviously, you can argue for or against that, right? But within the film, they argue that no, it hasn't been successful because as much as a ton of people have gone to jail for drug crimes, there hasn't actually been a lessening of offenders, right? You haven't actually stopped the usage of drugs. So unless like they say in the film that you consider like filling private prisons for financial money to be success, then yes, it has been successful. So I want you to argue your opinion there, or why not it's successful. How is the continuation of the war on drugs related to politics? Well, it has everything to do with politics, right? It's because politicians want to get reelected. They basically, almost as soon as they get into office, start campaigning for the next election. And politicians since Nixon onward have used the banner of tough on crime as a way to get elected, right? I mean, we talked about that, how like Clinton was one of the first Democrats that really wholeheartedly embraced this because he knew that he was being attacked quite a bit by Republicans that said, well, he's tough on crime because he's a Democrat. I mean, he's not tough on crime because he's a Democrat. So he ended up, while he was campaigning for the 92 election, going back to his home state of Arkansas and overseeing the execution of a man that was not mentally competent, meaning, was below the intellect to be considered mentally competent. So, yeah, basically that it's become a political strategy in order to get reelected, and it's very difficult politically for people to come out and say, no, let's let criminals out of prison, right? Because we have a lot of stigma and problems against criminals in society. So anyway, that's kind of what I'm looking for there. So if you just, elaborate on those things, but remember, answer each part of that, not just a sentence. I'm looking for a substantial answer, not like the whole page, but, at least to explain it. And you should do great on that. So hopefully this is helpful. And yeah, here it is.